Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm Mark Movsesian. I'm the director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's University. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Professor Mark DiGirolamo, who is the center's associate director, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is the keynote lecture in connection with part 2 of the center's Tradition Project by Sir Roger Scruton. The center is an academic research institution founded in 2010 at St. John's. Our many activities, including sponsored conferences and scholarship, colloquia, and also our award-winning blog, the Law and Religion Forum, are detailed in the materials that are there on your chairs, so I'm not going to take up time going through them all now. We are proud of what we've been able to accomplish in a very short time since our founding, with the support of the law school and with the support of our dean, Michael Simons, who cannot be with us tonight and sends regrets. One of our central programs, though, I do want to talk about, that's the Tradition Project, of which this lecture is a part. The Tradition Project is a multi-year research initiative that brings together leading public figures, scholars, judges, and journalists for lectures, workshops, and sponsored research on the value of tradition for contemporary citizens and the relationship of tradition and change in today's world. The main focus of the project is a series of conferences dedicated to specific themes. The first of these, focusing on the theme of tradition in law and politics, took place here in New York a year ago. This week, we're hosting part 2 of the project on the theme of tradition, culture, and citizenship. Our third session, which is going to be on the theme of tradition and the global clash of values, will take place next year in Rome in collaboration with our partners, Università LUMSA. The Dean of the Law School, Monica Lugato, is here with us tonight, and also Villanova University's McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy, and their director, Michael Moreland, is here tonight as well. I'll introduce Sir Roger in a moment, but first I'd like to thank 2 institutional donors who have given our center generous grants for part 2, the Achilles and Bodman Foundation, and the Notre Dame Program on Church, State, and Society, which is headed by Rick Garnett, who's also with us tonight. I'd like to thank our board member, Judge Richard Sullivan of the Southern District, who's here with us tonight, and also our other supporters who are here as well. We're grateful for all that you do for us. Finally, I'd like to thank Ms. Claire Policino of St. John's, who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes for months to make all of this happen. So thank you all. Now for our speaker this evening. Sir Roger Scruton is a writer and philosopher who's published more than 40 books in philosophy, aesthetics, and politics. He's widely translated. He's a fellow of the British Academy and also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He teaches both in England and America and is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. He's currently teaching an MA in philosophy for the University of Buckingham. Sir Roger, we're honored to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for all the organizers of this event, which obviously is a very bold adventure, given that you're defending concepts which have a decreasing place in the rhetoric of politics in the world in which we are. I've been asked to talk about tradition, culture, and citizenship, and I haven't chosen which of those to emphasize, so I will try and discuss the whole lot in the time available. But these are 3 very difficult concepts which bend and break if you put too much weight on them. They are the concepts for which people like us, I suspect there's a first-person plural I can refer to, that people like us reach for when we try to emphasize that society is not just a power struggle. It's not just a matter of one class or one group exerting power over another, and that politics is not simply about the distribution of power and privilege. It is about other, deeper, and more significant things which we know exist and which resound in our consciousness, but which we find very hard to define. But we are emerging from a long century in which the view of politics as power struggle has been the predominant one. From Karl Marx to Michel Foucault, the received idea has been that the only commodity in politics, the only thing that can exchange hands, really, is power. And all the rest is just the means for effecting this transfer. And this has a demeaning effect on the language of politics. People think only in terms of, as Lenin put it, whom. Who owns the power and over whom is it exercised? We see this as a growing, especially in Europe, a growing rhetoric of power analysis. And our Labour Party, whose fortunes you may have been following, has come to prominence because it is speaking this language. It's a language which young people can understand, even if they have no political culture, especially if they have no political culture. And of course, political culture is the thing that's being jeopardized by this, and the thing for which, as I understand it, this initiative is holding out. So these three concepts then, I'll deal with them one by one. Tradition first. When we justify something as traditional, what exactly are we doing? And is it a justification? We reach, as I say, we reach for this concept when under attack from people for whom innovation, progress, and enlightenment are the primary ideas, and who see the things that we are attached to as having no significance except as obstacles. And we try and to say that these are traditional things, and by that very fact are justified. And I think it's a very hard matter, a hard question, how you do justify traditions. First of all, one should distinguish the trivial traditions from the deep ones. There are a lot of traditions, like Highland dress, for example, the ceremony of carols at Christmas, Christmas itself, which, although they have a place in our souls and in our feelings, are nevertheless very recent inventions and really quite fragile. They could be taken away, and perhaps much of what matters to us would still remain. And indeed, one left-wing author, Eric Hobsbawm, member of the Communist Party until his death in recent times, wrote a book with a colleague on the invention of tradition, in which he argued that all traditions are simply inventions of in the present moment in order to give a spurious historical depth to the thing that you want to do anyway. And he took these examples like Highland dress, Scottish country dancing, the uniforms of the county regiments and so on, and laughingly dismissed them as ploys of the bourgeoisie to give a permanence to their fragile rule. But, and there's some truth in that, but of course, most people who've thought about it will recognize that those are very shallow traditions, those ones that we choose and fabricate in order to endorse our present predilections. There are deep traditions which have a kind of evolutionary character, that have emerged over time and adapted to change, and in which are indeed ways of adapting to change and understanding change, coming to terms with it. And the most important instance of this, in my view, is the common law of our two countries. The common law which we've inherited from Saxon times, but which underwent, of course, profound evolution in the Middle Ages, but which is nevertheless an uninterrupted tradition of social thinking about the realities of human conflict. I don't need to emphasize this, talking to lawyers, that the common law has the character of building up to principles from the resolution of individual cases. Especially this is true of the civil law, taking cases in tort and contract, trying to find the just solution, and from that, eventually proposing principles. Maybe it's only the higher courts that can extract those principles, the rationes decidendi of the case. But nevertheless, we recognize in this a way of thinking about human conflict, which has gone on for 1,000 years at least, perhaps even since the beginning of time, but at least for 1,000 years in our tradition, and has produced from the realities the principles which make sense of them. It's a kind of sedimentation of collective knowledge. That, to me, is a paradigm of what a tradition is. And just to reflect on the common law is to see why it is that traditions are valuable. They are ways in which we inherit a collective knowledge of solutions that we can't understand individually, but which, as it were, inform our decisions and enable us to act rationally, even in circumstances which we don't fully understand. The common law is a paradigm of practical knowledge. It's not contained in a single head, but it's implicit in the procedures of the courts and in the expectations of the people. And it has created in our people, in the American as much as the English and the British people, this sense that law actually exists as an objective thing. Even if you don't know what it is, you will be able to discover it once the case is brought to the court. And that has been, I think, a powerful influence in both our histories. One reason why the American Revolution, regrettable though I'm sure you think it is now, one reason why it did not lead to civil war and violence of the kind that we saw in France. But that's not the only example of this sort of tradition. Obviously, our political traditions are like this, the formalities of office. Traditions that inform the public world, the world in which decisions are made, they are constraints on people's behavior that prevent them from simply putting their own desires and their own ambitions in the center of the case, but force them to recognize their social membership. They're ways of acknowledging the existence and demands of others. And I think that's not only true of the political world, though that's really important, especially here in America, it's true of the private world too. Good manners are like that. Good manners are not simply ways of expressing your desires in a way that will accomplish them. They are ways of recognizing the validity of the desires of others, in particular, the desire that you shouldn't be a center of attention. Religious liturgies have some of this. These are formalized expressions of deep feelings. Imagine, when the taking of vows of marriage, it has a different character in a church from its character in what we know as a registry office. And the ceremony there sanctifies the choice. It unites it to the choices of indefinitely many people who have preceded you down this aisle and who have assumed the burdens and obligations of marriage. And that, of course, makes the obligation more permanent, implants it in the existential reality of the individuals who are standing before the altar. All these traditions go to the heart of what we are. They convey tacit social knowledge. They tell us what to do and what to feel at times when we need, above all, the comfort of knowing that others do and feel and have done and have felt as we do. And I think this is when we see tradition in that way, in its totality, as a way of understanding our social condition, we recognize that not only that it's indispensable to us, but also that it is a self-justifying thing. It is adapted because it deserves to adapt. So that's what I have to say about tradition. Now culture. This is an even more difficult concept. There are three areas of human life that compete for this label. There is what I would call common culture, high culture, and popular culture. All these involve residues of social knowledge and social being, but not all are equally valuable to us. A common culture consists of the customs and values and, of course, the traditions that hold the community together. It's a vital part of our being as social animals in the first place. High culture is the self-conscious and reflective part of it, the philosophy, historical narrative, and of course art, music, and literature and architecture. High culture is something that we teach, but common culture we acquire. And the relation between them is an extremely interesting and complicated one. Do they depend upon each other? Can they exist apart from each other? Those questions have become even more complicated in the modern world because of the invention of popular culture, by which I mean the whole system of entertainment which enslaves the ordinary person and from which most people in this room are comparatively free. Well, maybe not. But one difficulty for us is that these three things have come apart. Popular culture, common culture, and high culture were one and the same thing in Mozart's day when he wrote the Magic Flute. You know, that great, enormously popular, essentially musical, which is also one of the greatest, highest expressions of musical culture in our history, which was also part of the common culture of the theatre-going public of Vienna. So these things have now come apart. A traditional common culture is needed, however, as a foundation for citizenship. And so I think we need to reflect upon whether we still have such a thing, and if so, how do we shore it up against the corroding influences. We do teach citizenship also at the academic level through political science, law, and philosophy, which means that it has its place in high culture too. But popular culture often wars against citizenship in favor of other modes of collective being. Entertainment can easily take over, making us into passive recipients of the toys that distract us and undermining our sense of engagement in the surrounding civil society. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about later. In all this, though, religion clearly has an all-important place. Our common culture has a religious root, a Judeo-Christian root, but we nowadays are maintaining it in being even though it no longer clearly rests on that foundation. How long can we do this? Is it possible to do it? Should we be shoring up that religious foundation in order that our common culture should remain solid, as the solid possession of us all? And this question has become urgent, at least in part, because there is another common culture coming to the fore in the modern world, which seems not to generate anything resembling citizenship as we know it, and which is now competing for ascendancy, which is, of course, the long-standing common culture of the Islamic world. And I'll say a bit about that in a minute. Okay, so that's enough about culture for the time being. Now, citizenship. Citizenship, as I see it, is a specific form of communal life. It's not passive. It's not. You don't receive citizenship passively as you do the entertainment from the television or the welfare check from the government. Citizenship is a form of participation. It's an active thing. The citizen participates in government. He or she just doesn't just submit to it. So for us, law is not something you submit to, it's something you make. A citizen recognizes, of course, natural law, the limits, as it were, the moral limits on what can be legislated about, but accepts that in the end, he is part of a process whereby he and his fellow citizens make law for themselves. So citizens are not subjects. Interestingly enough, in my country, we are not citizens in law, we are subjects of Her Majesty, who is for the time being, a citizen of the European Union. But of course, this has slightly degraded the idea of citizenship in the eyes of the British people. But in another sense, of course, we are citizens just like you are. A citizen has a part in appointing the sovereign power and is, in a sense, part of that sovereign power, bound to it by a quasi-contract, which is also an existential tie. It's part of what makes him what he is and defines his loyalties. This may not be a democratic process, obviously it's perhaps an exception that citizenship is founded in some kind of democratic process. But the Roman citizen in the times of the empire was genuinely a citizen, even though it was not a democratic political order. And this is, of course, again, very much to be contrasted with the Islamist tradition. In Islamic society, the important laws are laid down by God or deduced from the hints that God has given us. And the subject must submit to them. That's what Islam means. You can't revise them, even when they are in conflict with reality, as they now are. These are unadaptable laws, which, because they weren't made by human beings, cannot be adapted by them. Citizenship, which is the assumption that it's your duty to make the laws, is therefore excluded as a form of blasphemy. And that has made it very difficult, of course, for the Islamic world and our world to coexist. The citizen is accountable as an individual, not as a member of a group, but as an individual, and his or her rights and duties are individual benefits and burdens. And that's a very important aspect of the concept of citizenship. So there are three concepts: tradition, culture, and citizenship. How do they relate? Well, I think we need, and perhaps to some extent have, a culture of citizenship. But to secure this, we need it because citizenship isn't something that comes naturally to people. You can't simply put people in a room and say, now you're all citizens, and assume that they will act in that way, because it involves taking responsibility for each other, being accountable to each other, recognizing that you are collectively making laws for your common governance, and doing this by a process of compromise. People don't do that naturally. That's not the default position of humankind, despite what has sometimes been thought. So there's a question as to how it is that we generate human beings who do have that instinct to associate in that way. It must only be because we have a culture of citizenship. And this is brought into being, first of all, because we distinguish civil society from the state. We recognize that society is not controlled by, imposed upon us by the state. It is something that arises through our free association. We also recognize, I think, that citizenship requires a special kind of education, which involves implanting in individuals the idea that they are accountable for their own lives, not just to God, but to each other and to the social order of which they are a part. And this education instills, or should instill, certain virtues in the citizen. Virtues of patience, tolerance of difference, respect for law and for promise-keeping, and the desire to take collective decisions by consent rather than by imposition. And that is a very important feature of the citizen, which you see very clearly in this country, that people do not take decisions for others without first consulting them and being prepared to compromise, to renounce what they most want in order to achieve an agreement. And that culture of citizenship and that form of education are, in my view, threatened by aspects of popular culture that valorize transgression and which induce a passive response to the social order, saying, it's not your business. You have no concern in this, they will provide. And I think that is a threat that we've all seen in recent years. Another and more interesting threat to me is the threat posed by the destruction of our cities. A citizen is a person who lives in a city. The city is the center of the kind of interaction that has made our civilization what it is. All these words, city, citizen, civilization, civil society, they all derive from the same Latin root. And the city is the thing that made us what we are, this center of administration and free decision-making, which depends upon citizens taking an active part in it. But I think, I won't dwell on this, but I think it's one aspect of the betrayal of citizenship by our high culture, that our architectural education has ceased to be a genuine form of education and lapsed into mere engineering, producing the kind of horrors that you see all around you here. Not this club, which has a little bit of architectural merit, but this voiding of the city of any message that it is a settlement for human beings, a place to which you can belong. Anyway, to leave that to one side, but I think we recognise that the culture of citizenship requires a very special education and a sort of complicity, cooperation in perpetuating it and amplifying it. And it involves also this education for accountability. We believe in the sovereignty of the individual. We don't necessarily use those words, but we do believe that each of us has rights and duties as an individual, which should be exercised with due respect for all the other individuals who also have rights and duties. And we teach our young to arrange their lives by compromise and negotiation. And most of all, we teach them the art of renunciation. However dearly you are attached to something, you must be prepared to renounce it if you are to live as a citizen among citizens. And all this derives from a deep truth, I think, embedded in the Judeo-Christian message. The truth that we rational beings, we free individuals, relate to each other in a very special way. We relate to each other as I to thou, not as objects, not as people who are exercising power over each other or trying to gain power from each other or steal from each other, but as people who are condemned by their own way of being to recognize the equal existence of the other. And all this, of course, is buried in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, which enjoins us to the love of our neighbour. But what is not always noticed is the dependence of this neighbour love and the tradition that came out of it on a clear conception of neighbourhood. Of course you must love your neighbour, but your neighbour must also be your neighbour. We are together, we recognise in our tradition, we are together in a certain place. And that is what that place sets the parameters within which we negotiate our shared sovereignty and our mutual accountability. And I think this point is of the essence and at the root of some of the crises we are undergoing. We've just seen one effect of these crises in the streets in the city a couple of days ago. The Islamist immigrant may have no idea that there are obligations that attach to this place and a need to obey the law made by the people of this place, regardless of whether they agree with him about religious or other ideas. And he is now one of those people. That's the idea of citizenship. You put aside everything, even your dearest beliefs, in order to make law with the strangers surrounding you. And it is, of course, an idea foreign to the Islamist terrorist. So in our tradition, accountability and national loyalty have grown together. And when detached from each other, in my experience, they both dwindle, as they have done in the European Union. The true cause of the Brexit vote, whatever one thinks about it, it's obviously very controversial, but the true cause of it, in my reading of events, is that people could take no longer the idea of being governed from elsewhere by people who had no attachment to the place where they are, where they, the people, are. This is our place, these are our laws, that's the thought, and we understand each other as neighbours, even though we don't necessarily know each other, and being Englishmen don't want to know each other. But still, that is the root of the legitimacy of the government that we enjoy. But now all our major decisions, including those about the most important issues like migration, are imposed upon us by people from elsewhere who have no love of this place and the traditions that have grown in it. So I think we have to take very seriously the neighbourhood idea and recognise that that might be a precondition of the emergence of citizenship as we know it. There's also a high culture that goes with this sort of accountability that I'm attributing to the citizen. The real hero of our literature is the individual, the one who has taken on himself or herself the full burden of individual existence and who shapes his or her life around the moments of critical choice. And I think this is not a new thing. You see it already in the Greek tragedies. It's there in Homer, that critical choice that he makes to renounce life with a goddess and immortality in order to journey back across those turbulent seas to his home. What an extraordinary thing to have done that. And yet, of course, we all look back on that work of literature and see in it the first stirrings of a spirit that we share. Right through to in the 19th century novels, like Jane Austen's crucial existential decisions that women had to make in those days, and beautifully dramatized in order to put the idea of the individual and her accountability in the center of our attention. And I think we misread the Enlightenment if we think it emphasizes individual responsibility and freedom for the first time. All the literature of our civilization, especially the literature of chivalry, is about this, as are the Shakespearean tragedies. And indeed, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that it all starts with Genesis, in which the story of which is about the accountability, the mutual accountability of God and the first man and Adam, they're trying to hold each other to account. At least God's holding Adam to account. It's true, it was an unequal partnership, and perhaps many Jews think that God ought to have been held to account as well, having put the poor buggers in that situation. But still, it's a complex thing, we all know that. But this high culture has reinforced the common culture of law-abidingness and neighbour love that we all share. However, the popular culture that we now see all around us has for a long time warred against citizenship. I think there are two major causes of this. One is not really cultural so much as political, but it has cultural consequences, which is the welfare state and the growth of dependency. For many people, it's no longer a matter, life is no longer a matter of accounting for yourself, it's a matter of presenting people with a bill to pay. And that has created, as Charles Murray and others have adequately described, a culture of dependency which is extremely damaging to the whole procedure of not just of citizenship, but of the democratic process. Also, of course, sex has become a transaction. Lots of influences have caused this, from pornography and the Kinsey reports, right, and right down to modern popular music. But eros, erotic love, is no longer an existential tie. Indeed, the love bit has been removed from it. And I think that has caused massive insecurity, especially among young women. The individual is no longer tried by life in many ways. The idea arises that he can obtain his rights, and it's a constantly expanding list of rights, the rights to all those welfare benefits, etc., without paying for them with his duties. And I think there's grown from this a generation of half-socialized children who are desperately insecure, not knowing what or whom they belong to, and searching for a group identity which they can affirm against the surrounding culture of responsibility. And I think that underlies developments that we've all been seeing recently, the emergence of these snowflakes into the academic world, unable to stand up in front of a warm adult human being without melting away, or forming a block of ice against him. And there's, of course, going with this, a culture of repudiation. The past, which is a great burden and brings with it all the responsibilities of citizenship and all the divisions of roles that go with that, that past has to be in some way policed. We have to sort it out into those bits that we can accept and those that we must reject. And the advocacy of safe spaces, of course, stems from this, and the whole culture in the academy of denying free speech to those who might pose a threat to the opinions that one thinks one has, even though one hasn't ever thought enough to have one. So that is a difficulty, which I'm sure people in this room have their own views about. But I think more important is that popular culture has seen a shift away from individual feeling and individual accountability towards crowd feelings and crowd, the burying of the individual in the crowd. Crowd emotions are distinct from individual feelings towards the things that concern one, because they come into you from outside. And they also relieve you of liability and guilt. They enable you to turn en masse against the scapegoat, as we all know, and drive that person to extinction. And in the modern situation of network building and social media and so on, the idea that the individual is judged by a hierarchy of laws and values overseen by a just God, that has very little application. The only judgment that many young people submit to is that the judgment of their peers, whom they probably don't know, their so-called friends on Facebook, who share with them the prejudices that they understand even less than you do. And so judgment becomes a kind of escape from judgment. You escape from judgment by losing yourself in the crowd emotions generated on the social media. And in crowd emotions, the duties of the citizen are swamped by a kind of collective hysteria. So that elementary principles of the moral life, such as the principle that audi alteram parti of St. Augustine, hear the other side, that principle of natural justice embodied in our administrative law is forgotten. And there's little or no distinction then between accusation and guilt. You've all seen this in the Weinstein case, and just any of you in this room could this moment have your careers destroyed because of that hand that you put on the wrong knee, even if you thought it was the right knee. There'll be a Me Too hashtag, which will drive you into obscurity. This is quite extraordinary, because the press take it up, even though only 20 years ago in my country it would have been actually a contempt of court for the media to retail these accusations of named people who have never been brought to trial for offences in which obviously the accuser was complicitous. So, I think you can see that the legal culture that is a necessary part of citizenship is rapidly being eroded by this new kind of crowd emotion. And mediating institutions also are losing some of their independent force. And obviously, when a country is governed by a Twitter account, that's bound to be one of the dangers. But we saw this much more seriously in the 20th century. And we're seeing with the total ineffectiveness of mediating institutions in the Nazi and Soviet revolutions, so they could be swept away just like that. And we're seeing it now with some of the effects of social media, the replacement of fair trials by witch hunts. And I think that it's not only social media that are blamed to this, but popular culture has been cultivating this for some time, from Woodstock onwards. Pop music has paved the way for this kind of collective Dionysian hysteria. The release into mass emotion, the collective I, which permits itself everything. Alan Bloom said some things about this in his great book on the closing of the American mind, and I think it remains true. So are we lost? Is there a way back? I know I've got to conclude this optimistically, so I'll begin with a glass of wine. and experiment with the answer, yes. The whole history of the settlement of America suggests that citizenship has been, from the beginning, wrested from an alien culture of hysteria. It is something that has been won from its enemies. That culture of divinely imposed laws, Puritan overseers, witch hunts and crowd emotions, wonderfully conveyed by Hawthorne in The Scarlet Letter and elsewhere. And the inspiration for the work of rescue has been the two great inheritances that that your country and my country share. On the one hand, territorial loyalty to this place where we exist as neighbours, committed to each other's defence, even though we don't know each other. That wonderful inheritance remains. And the other great inheritance of common law, that the law exists even if we don't know it, even if nobody knows it, exists there to be discovered and will provide us with the solution for our conflicts and the way of continuing to be at peace together. So, and I think these have been, in one way or another, celebrated also in the high culture of America and in the art and literature, which have made the fact of being here among people whom you don't know, but whose lives you must respect, that fact into the premise of your collective coexistence. And I think if you look back over the literature, art and music of your country, you will find this affirmed again and again, and it's the reason why that art and literature has endured. So it isn't all lost, and of course the existence of a gathering like this devoted to exploring these foundational concepts of our civilization is yet another reason why things will go on. So thank you.